Welcome back to the Dset office inauguration and international forum on supply chain resilience. I hope you all had a great lunch this time. For this afternoon, we will have two sessions. The first one will delve into economic security and the impact of industrial policy on supply chain resilience. The second one will invite industry stakeholders to share their perspectives on geopolitical challenges. For the first session, we will discuss industrial policy and the impact of export control towards the supply chain. This session is moderated by Dr. Lian Xianming. Joining him for the speaker are Mr. Bharath Harithas, Dr. Akita Igata, Dr. Matthew Duchadel, and Dr. Clara Hulihova. Please join me with a round of applause to invite our moderator and speaker of our first panel to be on the stage. 请跟我一起掌声欢迎主持人跟讲者上台。Before the panel started, allow me to do an introduction of our moderators and our speakers. Dr. Lian Xianming is the Deputy Director of Dset and the President of Chonghua Institution for Economic Research. As an esteemed economist, Dr. Lian has played a crucial role at Dset by providing valuable perspectives and research methodology from an economic standpoint. And our first speaker, Mr. Bharath Harithas, is the Senior Fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to this role, Mr. Harithas held a public service position in Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. He was also a member of policy formulation team for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For our second speaker, Dr. Akita Igata is the project lecturer of Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at University of Tokyo. Mr. Matthew Duchadel is the resident senior fellow and director at International Studies Institute, Montaigne. Prior to this role, Mr. Duchadel was the Beijing representative of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and deputy director of the Asian program at European Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Clara Hulihova is the member of Supply Chain Resilience Center at Charles University in Czech Republic. Please join me once again in welcome our moderator and speaker of the session. Dr. Lian, the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome everyone coming back to the session. So this session is about the economic security and its impact of industrial policy on supply chain resilience. As an economist, I have to say that this word actually doesn't actually feel very right. We used to talk a lot about the economic freedom. We talked about the supply chain efficiency. Now we talked about the supply chain security, we talked about supply chain resilience, and we talked about the industry policy. That was not there, I think, 5 years ago, and nowadays, almost every country is talking about the economic security. Taiwan is actually one of the few countries, I think, very few countries which has started the industrial policy and also the export control and the investment in restriction toward China. And I recall, when I was in college, that was 30 years ago, and it was total, I wouldn't say a total failure, but it's not a very successful policy, and it has been criticized by a lot of the company. And nowadays, I think that the United States actually has the policy, the small yards and high fence, and try to build up the alliance about the supply chain. So I want to start with about I think the Secretary of Commerce, Gina McDonald, she just mentioned about that a few days ago. She said that the high trade limits is non-negotiable in the United States. It appears that the United States want to continue to push this kind of the economic security policy, and also to continue to enforce the CHIPS Act on the semiconductor industry. And so what are the challenges that you think to enforce this kind of policy? How do you think it's going to have the impact on the supply chain?
It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for the invite. I think to meaningfully engage with the question on what are the challenges and opportunities for Taiwan, we first must answer and understand what the US's motivations and drivers are, what animates US action, what are they trying to achieve, what is the intended end game. And I think it all starts with semiconductors. So if you indulge me, I'd like to tell you the story of semiconductors, at least from the US perspective. So as everyone in the audience likely already knows, semiconductors have been around for decades. We just happen to call them microelectronics. From early transistors to complex integrated circuits, semiconductors have powered sort of the early computing, personal computing revolution to household appliances today. So what changed? Why this sudden fixation and preoccupation with chips? How did chips suddenly catapult or muscle their way to the center front of the policy stage? In 2018, Dario Amodei in OpenAI, he would, of course, then go on to co-found Anthropic. He wrote and published a paper, a fairly landmark paper. It didn't make the immediate impact and splash it should have, but he observed that if you were to plot AI capabilities on the y-axis and plot the amount of computing power used on the x-axis, you notice an almost perfect linear trend. And as any statistician here knows, getting that sort of linear trend where correlation almost perfectly equates with causation is almost a unicorn. And so what he observed, in fact, was that from 2012 to 2018, the amount of computing power required to train state-of-the-art models exploded by 300,000 times. Now, analogously, that's the difference between a Hyundai engine and a jet propulsion engine. In fact, compute grew so fast that the sacred Moore's laws collapsed. So compute doubled by 3.4 times every year instead of once every 2 years. And we've only seen that trend continue to increase in the years since. So from 2018 onwards, we've seen roughly compute grow by roughly 4 to 5 times per year. Now, just to give you an example, if you were to put $10,000 in your savings account with a 500% interest rate, within 15 years, you have an amount in the region of billions or trillions. 10,000, 50,000, 250,000, 1.25 million, 6.25 million, 3125 million, 156.25 million, and we're just in the first 5 to 6 years. And this is the compounding exponential growth we see with compute. This is the amount of computing power required to train frontier models today. So for some sort of more contemporary context, ChatGPT-2 required roughly 16 GPUs. GPT-4 required 25,000 GPUs. That was old news. That was just last year. This year, Grok, which is Elon Musk's model at X, is going to be trained on a 100K cluster. Meta's putting together a 350K cluster. So semiconductors clearly matter in the context of AI or training frontier models. So when the US thinks about, firstly, industrial policy and export controls, now they are really linked and they're sort of joined at the hip. They have a common objective. So first is to win the AI race. So you do this firstly by running faster through industrial policies. And then the second, you want to build the absolute largest advantage possible. So you try to kneecap your opponent and degrade their abilities to produce semiconductors. So this is really the sort of goal of export controls and industrial policy. Now for the question of, I think firstly, challenges of export controls. Well, I think a lot of people have been too quick to either say export controls are perfectly effective or that are not effective. I think the results are kind of mixed. So if we see, for example, for chips, we've already seen reports that show that chip smuggling is fairly leaky. We have seen reports of smugglers being able to smuggle over $100 million bulk orders and in fairly short lead time. And also the prices in the black market are roughly only 10 to 15% more than retail price. So smugglers are getting access to them in fairly sort of reasonable and sort of predictable ways. But for other things like lithography, for example, so a single EV machine is like 350 million, only 46 of them are made per year, and they're almost 3 stories high. They're very difficult to smuggle. So for those, we see export controls being slightly more effective. And then for other things like service and repair components, again, very important. EDA software, again, difficult for China to indigenize currently. But as we spoke previously, de-risking is not just something that's happening in the West or the US. China, in anticipation of future export controls, is also trying to indigenize. Huawei is said to be trying to replicate or create their own equivalent alternative to CUDA, which is the NVIDIA design software. They're trying to brute force what it can do, lithography, changing the overlays. It's too early to say whether this might happen or not, but we do see some trends in China indigenizing very rapidly. But for now, it seems export controls are somewhat effective. But it's quite indeterminate. I think that's the only factually accurate thing you can say.
So how do you think it's going to affect the supply chain?
So I think I'll focus specifically on Taiwan. So for export controls, well, the good thing with TSMC's business model is that it's almost insulated from export controls, not almost, but because it's a pure foundry model, end of the day, your wafers and chips are sent to NVIDIA, and they assume final liability for export controls. So any sort of direct impacts will be sort of downstream, and because a lot of your upstream sort of chip manufacturers and sellers, well, the Chinese exposure is really high, right? We know, looking at ASML's recent quarterly report, or even Micron, exposure is roughly 40 to 50%. So there's going to be some impact to TSMC because of that. But on the other hand, I think this will be offset by the ferocious appetite for GPUs. And only TSMC can produce the sort of leading GPUs that's used in AI data centers. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I think TSMC will continue to benefit. The second is opportunities from industrial policy. I think that sometimes this, when people talk about reshoring the US, they think the US wants to supplant TSMC or take over the entire supply chain. I think they're fairly clear-eyed that it's very difficult for them to do so. And so TSMC will continue to play a leading role, I think, in places like Arizona and all that, for continuing to produce the leading-edge opportunities. Also, I think people underestimate how difficult it is to firstly set up and scale a successful fab. And so I think for the long duration, I think TSMC will continue to be successful and be a leader in this industry.
That's a good news for Taiwan. Okay, so Akira, I just want to follow up because Japan happened to be, I think, the first country in Asia to establish the Ministry of the Economic Security, I guess. Yeah, and what do we think about according to the Japan experience, what do we think about the challenge to enforce this kind of economic export control policy, how to make sure that the economic security policy can be effectively executed, and also Japan just ordered like a 26 billion industrial policy on semiconductor, and of course a lot of them actually are for TSMC. And so what do you think about this kind of policy? Do you think it's effective to attract the investment?
There we go. Thank you so much for the introduction, Deputy Director. So once again, I'm Akira Igata. I run the Economic Security Research Program at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technologies at the University of Tokyo. And I've actually counted how many times our institutions have worked together this year. This is our 8th time. We've had meetings, workshop, young leaders program, symposiums here in Taiwan, in Tokyo, and even in Seoul in conjunction with the Seoul National University. That was 3 months ago. And if Jeremy decides to accept my invitation to come to Tokyo in 2 weeks, that'll be the 9th. So I look forward to our continued engagement. I'm happy to say that I'm finally going to be defending the MOU between Dset and my center next Wednesday. So let's keep our fingers crossed for that. So I think your question is critical. It's going to take about half an hour if I really want to comprehensively answer it. So let me try and focus into what kind of opportunities there are and what kind of challenges we have in Japan. And then for both opportunities and challenges, I'll break both of them up into domestic policies and foreign policies. So you have like 4 different aspects. So in terms of the opportunities in domestic policies, like you mentioned in the question, I think we now already have these new instruments in Japan. So now it's time to really implement it well. And if we implement it well, I think it'll be a great opportunity. For example, we have a law called Economic Security Promotion Act, or ESPA, which Professor Suzuki has talked about during the earlier sessions. And this allows us to engage in supply chain diversification in a very effective manner. To give you a very quick explanation of what it does, the Japanese government identified 12 strategic goods. So these are like semiconductors, batteries, liquefied natural gases, fertilizers, permanent magnets. And if you're a private sector working on these issues, then you can try to get subsidies from the Japanese government to diversify your supply chain. So this, I think, is a very good way for Japan to try and succeed in the long-term diversification of supply chains, which is so critical in this era of economic security. Another opportunity lies in the implementation of the new Security Clearance Act, which has just passed in the Japanese Diet. Once again, very quickly, this is a law that allows for the Japanese government to conduct background checks to those, even in the private sector, who is interested in getting a security clearance. So, it's a private sector that has to apply for this. And if this person gets a security clearance, then it allows for the government to share a little bit of sensitive information regarding economic security, like critical infrastructure or supply chain information, with those in the private sector. So this, once again, implemented correctly, would allow for a better public-private partnership in sharing the information and doing something together. And then lastly, there has been a whole lot of tech control measures. They have been strengthening knowledge security, export control, investment screening, and if done properly, we should be able to protect our technologies in the correct way. You look at foreign policy, and we have so many different minilaterals these days in the Indo-Pacific region, and I think Japan is in most of them. I think we're in the middle of all of this lattice work of new economic security alliances and partnerships that has been popping up, from Japan-US ROK trilateral to Japan-US-Philippines trilateral. There's the Quad, Japan, US, India, Australia. There's the Fab 4. There's the IPEF. There's G7. There's AUKUS Pillar 2. And I can keep on going. And this alphabet soup of different minilaterals on economic security issues can be capitalized, once again, if we can agree to start really talking about how do we counter economic coercion, how are we going to cooperate on supply chain diversification, and how are we going to be promoting critical and emerging technologies. Now, on to the challenges. I think the challenge is actually doing what we're supposed to do, which is, once again, can we really implement these new instruments in an effective way? And I say this because there's always the danger of doing too much, right? So, for example, let's go back to the first opportunity, the Economic Security Promotion Act. Protection is important. Supply chain diversification is important. But if you do too much, it starts to become a lot like protectionism, right? We would start to say, oh, this country is high risk. Oh, that country is high risk. Every other country is high risk. We can't trust anyone, so we have to reshore everything back to Japan, which would raise our security, right? That would make us more independent and autonomous. And I think we had a great question from the audience in the session 1 talking about how much security is enough. But my answer is, if you really think about zero risk, it's impossible, right? Which means that you do too much, and then all of those costs, extra cost of products, they're going to be imposed on consumer goods prices. So we don't want to be sacrificing that. So we want to be careful about that. On security clearance, it's going to be the big companies that's going to probably benefit, relatively speaking, because small and medium enterprises do not have the capability to try and have all of their workers to get these clearances. So once again, we have to try and make sure that we support the small and medium enterprises. And lastly, for the tech controls, I think we're doing okay on export control and investment screening, but with regards to research security, we have a long way to go, so we need to do a better job at that. And lastly, on foreign policy issues, I think the challenge is, and someone also touched on this in session 1, we have to reach out to the global South countries, or in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's Southeast Asian countries, but to do so, you need trust. And trust is both ways. We have to be able to trust them, and they have to trust us, not that we're trying to exploit them, right? So that's going to be some of the challenges.
Thank you. I think that's a very good discussion. Matthew, I know that Europe just rolled out the new initiative of the Economic Society, EU, and so what do you think about the opportunity and the challenge of the economic security in EU?
Thank you, Dr. Lian, and thank you, Dset, for the invitation. Economic security has just been called a central priority by the President of the European Commission when she released her letters of mission to all the commissioners, the new team, in fact, at the head of the European Commission, who still need to be approved by the European Parliament, but who should be in place by the end of the year. So when you think of this economic security now being a central priority of the new Commission, I think is quite interesting given the fact that the term only appeared 2 years ago in the language of the European Union. Actually, for the first time in a joint communiqué issued by the EU and Japan at the end of the 2022 EU-Japan summit. But here we are. Economic security is a central priority of the European Union. I think there is a very clear agenda, a clear roadmap for the European Union going forward. And I want to make 2 points to start with. The first one on this issue of supply chain, I think the awareness that the EU is highly vulnerable to supply chain disruptions is at the very core of this embracing of an economic security agenda. You have here the global share of supplies for critical raw materials. It's actually a problem for the EU, but it's a problem for everyone else, everyone with a strong industry. And this awareness that the EU is vulnerable has really accelerated this choice of adopting an economic security agenda. And here, in terms of vulnerability, I think the awareness of vulnerability is extremely linked to our perception of the EU-China relationship. On the one hand, the capacity and the intention of the Chinese side to use dependencies to coerce at times of political tensions. And on the other hand, the objective facts of sectoral dependencies on access to Chinese supplies for some key elements of the European industry. And here I want to mention clean tech, because a lot of the discussion here is about semiconductors and it matters for the EU as well. But clean tech matters enormously for the European green transformation and for the transformation of the European industry. So this has to be kept in mind, that the dependencies are very much linked to clean tech as well. And so, going forward, and I'm going back to my first slide just for illustrative purposes, I think that in the next 5 years, what you should expect, if you look at this list of economic security instruments that the EU has at its disposal right now, what is really striking is that they've all been adopted between 2021 and 2023. You have a list of instruments and they're all relatively new. And I think that what you should expect in the next 5 years is a more frequent use of those instruments, starting in the areas of managing technology transfers. What we will have by the end of 2025 is a serious improvement of the foreign direct investment screening mechanism and perhaps an outwards investment screening mechanism. You will have also some improvement made to the export control regulation or mechanism of the European Union. I think it's primarily directed at managing our relationship with Russia, but it also has clear implications for the management of our relations with China in the area of dual technologies. I think you may see also in the next coming years the EU using the anti-coercion instruments. It's actually an emerging discussion right now in Europe in relation to what is almost certainly coming, some degree of Chinese trade retaliation after the adoption by the European Union of tariffs on imports of electric vehicles. We hear that there might be retaliation on either brandies, so targeting France, or dairy products, mostly targeting Ireland, the Netherlands, and Spain, and perhaps also pork. In fact, 4 countries are really central to this retaliation, and some in Europe are arguing that this should be leading to a response in the form of an anti-coercion response. I haven't spoken about industrial policy and supply chain resilience yet. There are a lot of things to say about industrial policy. I think in the case of Europe, what you have to be aware of is that industrial policy was a very dirty word only 3 years ago, and that there was a deep belief in Europe that the market had to dictate outcomes. And I think that we've crossed that threshold already, thanks to the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act means something in terms of the way the EU approaches intra-European competition. We need a very strong competition law to maintain the European single market. Without competition law, the single market disappears. So it's a delicate balance that we have to manage by comparison to nation states, right? But it's clearly going in that direction, and addressing supply chain vulnerabilities is the main engine of that change.
Thank you. I think that Matthew just raised a very interesting point particularly about the progress of the EU security instrument, and we're going to talk more about that. But there is a second guest, I think, from the Europe, and Cora, and you are from the Czech Republic, and you can talk more about particularly Czech is very close to Ukrainian, and you probably are going to feel a little bit different compared to others EU countries about this economic security. Can you just elaborate about the opportunity and the challenge that you have regarding the economic security?
Okay, so firstly, let me thank you for inviting me for this opportunity. And I'm proud that I'm the only woman who is speaking today. And I'm also, I think I'm the only lawyer. I'm not sure if I should be proud of it, because lawyers always pointing out about some difficulties, about possible penalties and liabilities, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Yeah. I'm going to talk about, not exactly about economic security related to situation in Ukraine, but I'm going to speak about the European regulation. We are standing at the era of European Green Deal. European Green Deal is number one agenda of European Commission, and from our Czech perspective, we are starting to think that the European Union starting to be overregulated by many regulations which are on the table. Not even sustainability regulation, but also EU CHIPS Act, also regulation about cybersecurity, regulation about deforestation, regulation about gender diversity, etc. The trends of regulation in the area of sustainability is very important in European Union. It comes from recommendation of United Nations and OECD, and follows the Paris Agreement and following Glasgow Climate Pact. But what is the important? From recommendation and soft law rules, we have now strict and tight and robust system of liabilities and responsibilities. We have two key directives which every big company in the European Union has to follow. Is Directive on Corporate Sustainability Reporting and Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. What does it mean for you, maybe for Taiwanese companies? If you want to expand your enterprises and your semiconductor industry in European Union, in Czech Republic or in Germany near to Dresden, you have to be in compliance with these rules. And these rules mean that whole your supply and value chain is in compliance with the European aim to prevent adverse impact on human rights and adverse impact on environment. You have to not only report about what you are doing to protect the human rights and your company, but also what you are doing to protect the human rights and environment at the end of your supply chain. So Mathieu was discussing the raw materials, but it's minded in the world. So imagine if you are a producer of chips in European Union or in Taiwan, and your supplier of minerals is from Russia or another Asian country, you have to have checked that the mining worker or another labor force have the equal conditions, has treated as in alliance with the regulation, in alliance with human protection. And this is going to be tough. You have to report about it, and you also have to provide due diligence. You have to have a code of conduct. You have to have particular transition plans, not even code of conduct. And you have to say every year what you are going to do to adjust the climate change in accordance with Paris Agreement. You, like a private company, you are responding about what was agreed between governments of nations. So also what would be critical even for Taiwanese companies while producing in European Union is going to be that they will have to try to seek obligatory contractual assurances that all supply chain partners, business partners, upstream, downstream business partners are in compliance with human rights and protection of the environment. And what I think is the most challenging now, and what is something new, which arises from European regulation, is the civil liability. You have in Taiwan definitely a general system of civil tort law. Same we have in Czech Republic, same is it in Germany, Japan. But there is a new requirements for specific civil liability for joint and several liability of the European company, European producer, and its business partner. So in case that Taiwanese companies set up a subsidiary in European Union and its supplier broke up the human rights, so you will be jointly and severally liable for this what happened in Russia or elsewhere in Asia. And there is many questions which is on the table, like causality, burden of proof, and the amount of possible litigation in this case. So I think this is a big threat which every potential investor in European have to focus on.
Thank you. So that's pretty much the first round of the questions. So now let's move to the second round of questions. So, Bras, I probably are going to ask you again. So what are the, so we talk a lot about the export control. Export control actually require, just like Akila said, you need the information, you need a lot of international collaboration. So what do you think about that each country can do to collaborate, and particularly not just about with others, but with Taiwan on that respect? Do you think that is going to actually to have impact particularly on the semiconductor industry?
So I think there's been quite a lot of talk on whether we can come or arrive at a multilateral regime for export controls investment regime. So the current problem is that I think on one side, the US perhaps expects partners to take a step too far in mirroring controls, and they've successfully persuaded Netherlands with ASML to mirror US export controls. There were attempts at trying to get Japan to do the same, but I think Japan was able to use the Nippon Steel debacle and then buy some time till elections, and then maybe we'll revisit the issue. So not entirely successful because, like I mentioned, the Chinese exposure for semiconductor companies is just really high. So it's very difficult to convince. And then, as many former bureaucrats here know, there's worry about setting a precedent that if you take a step too far now, there'll be expectations that this might become a slippery slope. So that's one side. On the other side, I think allies are also starting to realize that if they do not perhaps arrive at some sort of negotiated deal with the US will start to strong-arm them in sort of bilateral and smaller settings into accepting more stringent export controls. So I always say that currently, what is a way we can come together at a highest common denominator approach? Perhaps you do not agree to everything the US wants, but you sort of increase the sort of flaw of what you're doing on export controls. And I think currently the problem is that a lot of allied partners are getting picked off one by one. So the US has had a very clear threat definition on China. It's a very clear playbook or prescription of what it needs to do, and it's moved very quickly in bilateral, trilateral settings to try and sort of convince allies to accept certain export controls. Now the problem is Europe, for example, is perhaps in a weaker position than it was. There's the front in Ukraine, and there's certain macroeconomic indicators that make it, Europe has relied on, I think, three sort of legs. I mean, one is the security umbrella of the US, and they're starting to unravel the NATO issues, the energy sort of question with Russia, and then export market to China. So it's in a weaker negotiating position than it used to be. And the problem in Asia is that a lot of countries, for example, even Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, historically have viewed each other as competitors in the semiconductor industry. I think there's a lot of room for us to be able to come together and see, can we sort of try to collectively bargain with the US on what is a feasible and sensible export controls regime. So end of day, the US gets allies to persuade themselves to do a little bit more, and allies themselves ensure that they do not get picked off one by one. So what is the highest common denominator approach? I think that is the best way forward.
Exactly. I think Bharat just mentioned a very important point. I think Clea and I, when we were in the South Korea's meeting, we actually have discussed that it's important for the international collaboration on the export control, but it seems like U.S. is always the lead and to take the action, and each country actually can only follow. But it's still going to create some sort of like a symmetric position in terms of the Asia country actually are the ones a lot of time to enforce that, but US actually is the one who make up the plan for the Asia country to execute that. And Akila, what's your take on that, and how do you think that we can actually improve the process and make the export control more effective?
There we go. So that's the difficult part, right? I mean, yes, I think there are logics from the Japanese side that we can understand that's being presented from the US. For example, there are certain countries that have used these critical and emerging technologies for military uses. So maybe we should not be doing trade or working with them in the same ways. We get that. Maybe if we keep on doing the same thing with an economy that subsidizes its industry too much, then it's not a fair game. So even from the economic perspective, perhaps we should try and engage in similar export control or investment screening mechanism. There's, I think, also a strong case for human rights where there have been reportings on certain countries, certain regions where apparently they use this forced labor. So if we want to make sure that we're not indirectly supporting these human rights abuses, then we too should engage in certain export control or investment screening against critical and emerging technologies. However, the difficult thing is that we all need to have cheap products, or at least there's a demand for cheap products, for high quality products. So there's a limit to how much we can follow the Americans. I think there's also a question about, yes, we might end up going there, but let us first discuss among ourselves to get there, right? So I think I'm relatively pro-China in that I think we have to accept what the US is saying with regards to export control and investment screening in the end. But there are others, perhaps majority of those in Japan, who thinks that maybe US is being a little bit too pushy in these areas. So I think the key word is policy coordination, right? We need more of these dialogues, not just at the track 1 government level, but track 2, track 1.5, just like this, where we talk frankly about how we see things and then try to find some sort of a solution where we can all agree.
So, Matthew, the EU has a lot of countries which need a lot of negotiation on the economic security policy. Can you share us a little bit about the EU experience, how to actually to do the coordination and to actually to have the negotiation within the EU countries?
Sure, and precisely on export control, because I also want to react and before being slightly self-critical, because the Europeans are always slightly self-critical, I just want to make the point that the area of technology transfers has really changed a lot in Europe over the past 5 years. And I think it's driven by the European Commission a lot. Of course, because it's Europe, there's always some degree of resistance from member states or from companies. But what has really changed is two things. First, there's been a clear link articulated politically between the need to overhaul technology transfers management and the question of PLA modernization, and that comes from the European Commission. I think no national leader would have been willing to go that far, but this has happened already. I think that bridge has been crossed. And the other area of deep change is the realization that we need to link export control, investment screening, and intangible technology transfer, so especially the area of research and education cooperation. And what is happening in Europe right now with the 4 first critical technologies listed by the European Commission, so AI, semiconductor, quantum, and biotech, is a new common list that will be used, regardless of the type of access, whether it's through trade or whether it's through investment or whether it's through education exchanges. So I think this is changing very quickly. Now for the self-critical parts, I think we know where the weaknesses are when it comes to managing technology transfers. I think weakness number 1 is enforcement capability. And in fact, having followed the US, Japan, Netherlands discussion regarding lithography, it's very clear that the overwhelming advantage of the US is intelligence regarding end users. And so it's very difficult, for example, for the Netherlands to be able to reach the same level of very granular assessment. And that's a question of intelligence capability to monitor end users. And in the case of Europe, the reality is that if you want to reach that level of intelligence, it needs to be at the European level. It will be difficult for single member states to develop that kind of capacity. And the other area, and it's actually more linked to foreign policy, is the question of transfers to Russia. And in fact, going around the sanctions mechanism. And here it's a major issue for the European Union because the Russia-Ukraine war is a matter of national security for most EU member states. And we have many loopholes actually across Asia. So articulating this with our technology transfers management is also a matter of priority.
Clara, go ahead.
I will also answer if the question is the challenges for the export and cooperation between Taiwan and Czech Republic. I will again answer from my legal and academic perspective. I think the first thing is the opportunity to participate about improvement of our legal system, about protection of the production. I think, as it's also pointed out at our newly yesterday adopted national semiconductor strategy, it's crucial to develop a strong policy about intellectual properties protection, about cybersecurity, data protection, and about using AI technologies and automation and liability arising from using of AI technologies. That's the first thing which can help both Czech Republic and Taiwan when promoting supply chains within the European Union. And the second perspective, it's following what I was telling you about before. It's you may help us to fight the overregulation because from my point of view, when I'm going to some conference in the European Union and try to say that Green Deal is somewhere too much, it's too much regulation, too much liability, I'm the bad guy. Yeah, everyone thinks, yes, it's totally normal. I think it's normal. Generally, protect human rights and environment is totally cool. It's fine. It's something I will stand for. But the amount of regulation and the internalization of the externalities, which public sector is not able to deal with, and is now should be paid by the private sector, by its reporting, by its due diligence. It's enormous. And from our perspective, from small post-communist country with small industry, it's really hard to keep on with this regulation because we have struggling with problems of financing the foundations of SMEs, financing the administration, and even our government and our statutory administrative offices have problem to follow all the new regulation which is on the table. So I think if there is some strong, rich, trustworthy business partner such as Taiwanese companies and Taiwanese government, and who says maybe it's too much, it will, it may help us.
We were supposed to open to the public now, if you all think okay, and we probably start with the question from the floor. I do have a lot of questions for you, maybe later. And so why don't we just start collecting the question from the floor?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the vibrant and thought-provoking presentation and discussion. Now we invite our guests to ask questions. Please raise your hand and kindly state your name and identify your affiliation. Please over there.
Okay, this is Bright. I have a question for Matthews. As you know, that I've involved in the cybersecurity committee and the standards for over 5 years at SEMI-Taiwan. But my question is cybersecurity standard for the high-tech general. And because a couple of our high-tech clients are tracking about EU Cyber Resilience Act, right, which will regulate the ICT product in the EU. And particularly, I think it's critical for Taiwan industry because Taiwan is good at OEM for different industry. However, those standards are facing multiple standards and multiple regulations in Europe or in different country or area. And if for those OEM company, do you have any suggestion how to understand or how to see the Cybersecurity Act, Cyber Resilience Act in Europe as general? Thank you.
Thank you. We will take 3 questions at a time. And over there, there's another, okay.
I have a question for Mr. Harithas. I'm wondering how this company in United States complies the U.S. trade regulation because there's a contradiction intensive between governments and the company. And what's the how does think tanks play a role between the companies and the U.S. government? Because think tanks may be sponsored by the private sector, but also they provide policy advisement to the government. Thank you.
Hello, Aaron. I'm Taipei citizen, and I think it's a general understanding that Chinese government continue to innovate new business model to avoid the global regulation of transferring the technology. And for example, I continue to use, and also Chinese business also relocate the manufacturing base elsewhere to Southeast Asia, etc. And so I wonder how do we deal with such kind of issue? And most recently, I think China are, from the news that we know, they are interested to set their their AI lab or R&D center in Saudi Arabia. So I think my question is, how do we deal with such issues that they use third areas, third countries to avoid the global regulation? Thank you.
Thank you. We will take another round of the question later. So the first question is about how OEM company can navigate the multi-standards in Europe when it comes to cybersecurity. And the second question is about the compliance and the role of think tank. And the third question is about China's influence in the third country and how we deal with it. Over to Dr. Lian.
I will answer shortly because I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, but what you say points to one very central element of the ongoing industrial policy discussion in the EU. I think there has been almost a political decision, we can say, at this time, that building what is called the Capital Market Union is the best way to be able to find enough capital to scale up some industrial projects. We always speak of the EU as the single market, which is true. But when we speak of single market, we also have to keep in mind that there are some areas of the EU's economy that are not part of a single market. And that's true, and I think it relates to your question of telecommunications. In fact, you have 27 telecommunications market. It's true also of tax collection. You have 27 national approaches to taxes. And it's true to a large degree of some aspects of the banking system. So as always, the EU works by building common standards and also building best practices in the cybersecurity area. That's been the role of the European Union. And I think the role of the European Commission should not be overemphasized. It creates an overarching policy framework, but then the member states are in the lead when it comes to implementing. So I think it will take time, but we are going in that direction. And also a point on Chinese overseas investments as it relates to Europe, because it's clearly a major issue. The investment screening mechanism of the EU is very clear that investment should be screened when it poses a threat to either national security or public order. And when the regulation was established, I think the two real targets were critical infrastructure and access to sensitive technologies. I think the regulation is there to prevent that foreign direct investment has an impact in those two areas. So when you speak today of investment in the automotive sector, for example, I think the thinking in Europe is not securitized. It's the other way around that you see. You see European member states, EU member states competing for BYD investment, and that is happening between Hungary, Spain. France has also been trying really hard to attract investment in the automotive sector. The question I have in mind, and it's only a question, I'm not sure how this is going to play out in the coming years, but I assume that this could become securitized as well, because the whole trend is moving in that direction.
Second question. So if I understood it right, I guess one part of the question was on how we inform and improve governmental compliance. And then the second part was on, given funding sources, how we remain independent. Was that something to the effect of your question? Yeah. So I'll answer the second one first. So I think it's not entirely true that we're beholden to private sector funding. A larger chunk of our funding comes from governments themselves or from foundations, and we always try to maintain that editorial independence. For example, regardless of sponsor, no one reads our reports till they are published. And the second one, there's another example of where a report was funded by a private sector entity, and then the report we published was actually a scathing critique of everything they'd done over the past 2 to 3 years. And so for CSIS, we are one of the few non-partisan think tanks, and so maintaining that credibility is really important. And then the second are what the actual role of think tanks are. So BIS is really quite a lean organization. They've always had challenges getting more appropriations and more funding, and they arguably need a lot more money to enforce export controls better. So they have roughly 50 field enforcement officers, and their number of officers stationed or located in China actually in the low single digits. So they don't really have the time to do all the hard thinking, the data compiling, the data modeling. So what we do is that we try to do that. We try to see what is the effectiveness of export controls. So for example, the report that got me hired was on chip smuggling. And so I did an 8-month report trying to understand how smuggling to China might happen, how do you improve export control compliance, writing the playbook for them. And then other things like, for example, is China successfully indigenizing certain semiconductor technologies? So these are all the things that government officials simply would like to do but don't have the time to do. So we sort of create this sort of body of work of research, and then we put it in the hands of government and say, okay, and then based on this, you choose to do what you want to do with it. But our role is really to fill that gap between, like, we have certain intuitions, we think export controls might do this, is it right or is it wrong? And so we do the research on that, put it in the hands of the government officials, and then they decide what to do, yeah.
Thank you very much. Do you also want to respond to the third question first, or third question is about the different company actually set up in different countries, so to avoid the export control regulations. Akira, you want to talk a little bit?
In the end, if the competition is a fair competition, then even if it's China or Russia or any countries, then supposedly it's fine, right? Because we live in a free economy. But then if there are countries that doesn't follow by the rules and doesn't follow by the law, then of course we have to be careful. Except there's a limit to what one company can do in terms of understanding all of your supply chains or knowing all of your customers. And yes, there are now these new companies with all of these China intelligence or supply chain intelligence, investor relationship that would help a company to understand who you're selling to, what you're buying from. But the thing is that costs a lot of money. And one thing I've always been struggling a little bit is, yes, we have all of these private sector companies, intelligence private sector companies, doing a lot to correct all of these important economic security information. And I understand that they have to find clients to sell them. But then this should really be public goods. So I wonder if there's a way for us to start thinking about how maybe the government, the European Union, the America, the great country to I don't know, have either buy these companies or internalize some of these capabilities or make available some of these data out there that would allow companies, not just big multinational companies, but small and medium enterprises too, to be able to understand what they're buying. Is it, has it used forced labor or not? Or who we're selling to, is this going to be used for human rights abuses? Or is this going to be used by the military or not? And once again, I don't really have a good answer to this, but I feel like as long as this a highly sensitive and useful information is in the hands of the private sector, then it's going to make it difficult for most of the 99% of the companies which cannot afford to have access to this.
I think that's a very good point.
Okay, thank you. And we will take another round of questions. We will collect 3 questions. Please raise your hand and state your name and identify your affiliation. Over there, please. A gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hello, my name is Mark. I'm from master's student at NCCU in diplomacy. I had a question for in regards to, I saw your PPT about the raw materials around the global supply of raw materials, and a lot of them coming from China and Russia. I wanted to ask, is it possible for the EU in any way to try to find other countries to to lower their dependence on China, to find other countries to find some of these raw materials from, for example, maybe parts of Africa that weren't mentioned on the list, or maybe using Taiwan's connection with Southeast Asia to find other materials, or is China and Russia the only ways to get some of those materials for the EU? Thank you.
Hello, this is Perry, and have one question. Taiwan companies are taking both business strategies and actions to mitigate the negative impacts from geopolitical dynamics. We all know about this, and such as diversifying their capacity in Taiwan. But from a different angle or perspective, Taiwan is increasingly exposed to higher geopolitical risks. So under the limited resources, any suggestions that what industry or technology innovation that Taiwan government should invest in Taiwan in the next year or in the next era, or the priority in industry development? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brian from New Bloom. I'm wondering if there have been attempts by the EU, for example, or Japan to review points of vulnerability in supply chains, similar to, for example, the Biden administration with the 100-day review of, for example, critical points of weakness. So I'm interested in understanding one's own self-understanding of one's own supply chain in that sense.
Thank you. We will have the third round of questions. So the first question is about, it's for Dr. Duchâtel regarding the raw material, and second is the suggestions for government to invest. And the third question is regarding the weakness of supply chain. Over to you, Dr. Lian.
Do you want to answer the first question? Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out something from the first circle of questions, like a small remark, that there was a discussion about cybersecurity and influence of China. As far as China and everyone is behaving in accordance with law, it's totally fine. But I think we have to discuss the problems of cybersecurity and cyber attacks and other security issues in that way, that we have to have precisely stipulated rules of judicial punishment of such attacks. And similarly, international society must behave in accordance with international private law and punish every such attacks, and must be clearly declared. And therefore we need more regulation. We need just clearly declare something is wrong and to use our courts in this case. That was my question. Answer.
Well, I think we know the different policy instruments that can be used to reduce excessive dependencies on critical raw material procurements. I think it's pretty clear in the heads of governments. And a few things here. I mean, first, the private sector is really on the front line when it comes to reducing their own vulnerabilities. The problem is that they don't really talk openly about it. You can interview some large companies that will explain to you how they have acted in the past 3 years to reduce dependencies in terms of critical raw materials, but also the other vulnerabilities in their supply chains. It's often, adding B plants, increasing the number of suppliers. They are doing stockpiling, but they don't really talk about it. Usually, they have many companies within one corporate roof, and each of them has their own stockpiling strategy. I mean, you hear this from different companies. So that's at the level of the private sector. And in fact, the private sector is really doing a lot in that area. At the level of government, when I look at the EU, I mean, first, there is this target that the EU has for 2035 to reach 10% of local production, which is extremely ambitious given the opposition across the European Union to any mining project, but there's one. The second area is recycling, and that's related to the circular economy, and here there are also very ambitious targets. The third area is what we've been discussing since this morning, friendshoring. In the case of the European Union, it relates very much to the trade negotiations that are going on with a number of countries and that are difficult to conclude. The one with Australia that could have been extremely helpful has so far been suspended, but the access to critical raw materials is part of that. And finally, I think the fourth instrument is really industrial policy, because when it comes to clean tech, building a battery supply chain inside Europe creates purchasing power and creates market scale to also diversify imports. So, it's a long answer, but there are many different tools that can be used to reduce dependencies. We have an excellent example in the case of Japan. I should have added rare earths imports and the China-Japan crisis from 2010. Dependence was reduced a lot, but dependence was not erased or deleted. There's only so much that you can do. You went from about 90% to less than 70, right, about that. And this is happening also in the case of Europe.
Maybe I can try to take a crack at the second and the third question. What should Taiwan invest in? You guys are already doing a lot on semiconductors and AI. Everyone's talking about quantum is next, right? I disagree. I mean, quantum is going to come, but I mean, it's going to come in maybe 5 years to 10 years. So you need to, keep the industry alive. So some sort of investment is important, but I would put my money on biomanufacturing. I mean, you look at government policies in the US, EU, India, China, even Japan. The governments are starting to increase our investment into biomanufacturing, which has implications for energy security, food security, climate change. So this is a very general advice. If you want a more tailored advice, please come see me afterwards, and I'll show you how much you need to pay me to hear my investment advice. And then on the third question on the supply chain resiliency and supply chain vulnerabilities, you're right. The Biden administration about 2 years ago ordered all of these different ministries to do a check on where their vulnerability lies in the supply chains. And then they had the 100 days midterm report and then a more comprehensive report afterwards. Japan has done something similar. And the result of that is the new Economic Security Promotion Act, which, again, the government, using this knowledge about where their supply chains are vulnerable, decided to subsidize some of these areas where we need to either friendshore or reshore. And I think a similar activity is probably being done everywhere at the moment. Some makes it public, like in the US. Some probably keeps it internal because, I mean, why show the world where you're vulnerable, right? But I think all countries are doing this at the moment.
So the Department of Commerce recently stood up the Supply Chain Center. And so I think they had roughly 150 people working on a model to predict geopolitical risks and saw supply chain vulnerabilities. I think it only got kickstarted last month. But so they will be looking at sort of across the economy, what are some macro sort of vulnerabilities as well as consultations to companies. So this is something that the US is definitely doing. But of course, the model is not public. I haven't seen it yet, so I can't speak to how good it is, but I'm imagining 150 bureaucrats working on it. It's about as good as it gets in any government. So I think we can be fairly optimistic about it. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, Speaker, for the insightful responses. We will take another round of questions over there.
Hi, I'm Christopher Chen from National Central University, and I also happen to be a conference interpreter. So I'd like to give another question, but a little advice to the organization, because we all see that today we are using AI subtitles. But I have to say that as a conference interpreter, the result is far from ideal. So, yeah, I'm talking for my supply chain. So, because I understand that, it's high tech, etc. But I believe that when we have this kind of conference and event, it is to share ideas and to exchange. And if everybody's not understanding perfectly all that is said, it is really a shame. And I understand that conference interpreters are not cheap, but we are good, you know. Yeah, so thank you. Little advice. Thanks.
Thank you for the suggestions. And over there, there's another lady with a jacket over there.
Thank you. I'm Judy Lin. I'm a contributing commentator for DigiTimes. When we talk about economic security, normally we think about supply chain resilience and think that it is okay to pay more for resilience. However, when all of the people are building semiconductor fabs, we see that the utilization rate has dropped enormously, significantly, especially for companies that are making legacy chips. So I'm just wondering, when we talk about economic security, while the profitability of fabs in the democracy allies are dropping, how do we, try to solve this problem? Even though we think that resilience is what we need, however, we are hurting the economic security for our legacy chips. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take another questions.
Thank you. My name is Kevin. So when we talk about industrial policy, you rightly pointed out that the EU is not a monolithic entity. There's a lot of competing interests in which it had to be harmonized to come to the state of the industrial policy today. But when we translate that to Taiwan, considering the politicization of much of the policy in Taiwan, what advice could you give from the EU side, Japan's side, the US's side, on how Taiwan can formalize a industrial policy whilst mitigating the impacts of domestic policies in order for Taiwan to strengthen its own supply chain in the semiconductor space for the next decade? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take another one.
Hello. My name's Celine Fan from AmCham Taiwan. I just want to go back to the cybersecurity and also chip security issue that was briefly touched on before. So what suggestions would you have for Taiwan to strengthen the supply chain resilience through standardized security acts or just standardized approaches to the digital supply chain or standardized risk assessment approaches in terms of cybersecurity? Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question is about how to increase profitability, how to secure profitability when we are talking about economic security. And the second question is your suggestions to how we can mitigate to lower the political polarization's impact towards our industrial policy. And the third one is regarding to the cybersecurity question. And over to you, Dr. Lian.
Let me try to answer your first question by answering, I don't have a great solution. I mean, yes, we need to increase our resilience, which means we can no longer rely on certain countries or regions where we used to rely, which means supply chain shift is necessary. But then to make this shift, of course, the government would want to, or at least the private sector would want some sort of a subsidy from the government because they're doing something that's not economic. The government wants the private sector to shift our supply chains because of national security issues. So subsidies are necessary. But then if we start coordinating, about let's not all invest in same areas, right? For this part of the supply chain, Japan will take care of it. This would be Taiwan. This would be Europe. This would be Czech Republic and so on. And if we do that too much, then that's basically an international cartel. Right? So you need to leave some sort of a competition. So the answer is somewhere in the middle. And I think the answer that we kind of ended up with de facto at the moment is, yes, this is costly. Yes, there may be some overlaps. Yes, we're going to be wasting some of our taxpayers' money, and there would be winners and losers, but that's the necessary cost of making sure that we are independent, or we are no longer dependent on certain problematic countries. If anyone has a better idea of how to change the current state to a different state, then I think you have many governments that would be interested in hearing your ideas.
I will respond what you have said, so answer the first question. I think in case of Czech Republic, we have the same attitude. In accordance with the national semiconductor strategy, our government plans big financial support from companies which wants to introduce their business in Czech Republic. But still, we have the European Union regulation of financial support, and its main aim is to reduce the breakage of competitive and the yes. So, and the second problem is, or the second issue is, if someone wants to develop a business in European Union, he has to do by equal opportunities, equal conditions, same conditions as everybody else. So once there's going to be some cartel, some agreement which is contrary to law, it's definitely going to be a problem. But in other circumstances, I don't see a problem to establish a public support in this way.
Boris, you want to talk about the industrial policy?
Yeah, I'm not perfectly clued into Taiwan's sort of domestic political struggles, but to me, when I think of industrial policy and countries that have successfully done it, I immediately think of Taiwan. I think of Japan, Korea, Singapore. I think of this cluster of East Asian countries. And in terms of what Taiwan needs to do more, I think Taiwan has already done a great deal. I mean, you've done everything from last year Maurice Chung came to MIT to give a lecture on what factors that he thought made TSMC successful. And a lot of this, I think, apply to industrial policy. I think the first one was it takes a long time. And I think the point you're making, you will be unproductive if you have poor yield rates in the first few years. CapEx write-downs probably 15 billion per year. You need subsidies to prop it up. And so the Taiwanese government did that a long time. They took a bet on TSMC. They took a bet on Maurice Chung. They rescued them when they seemed in a deficit. And it's the accumulation of long-term institutional knowledge, tacit knowledge, experimental know-how that eventually leads to cost efficiencies. Being a competitive fab is not just by being able to produce 2nm chips, it's to be able to do that at scale and selling them at price competitive numbers. And so TSMC has done that. Taiwan has ensured consistent sort of talent pipeline. So your top engineers from your top universities all joined TSMC. And Maurice Chung made a really sort of, I thought, insightful point. When he was at Texas Instruments, labor attrition rates year on year were roughly 15 to 25%. And so people tended to leave at a lot of churn. In TSMC, the average labor attrition rates were below 5%. And this is how they were able to accumulate the long-term institutional tacit knowledge. And that is what made TSMC so competitive. And then the third point, this is almost a labor cultural point. Now, your engineers at TSMC take a train on Monday morning. They go to a dorm. They live there till Friday. They take the train back. And they work in fairly militant sort of working cultures. I mean, at one point I remember when TSMC seemed to be losing out to Mong Song when he went to Samsung. Maurice Chung started what was called, I think, the Nightingale operation, which is that they will do 24-hour 3 shifts of R&Ds. And so it's a very brutalist, sort of difficult working culture. And there's a reason why I think some other countries might not be able to do this as well. So Taiwan is all of this. So you have firstly long-term cost efficiencies, you have the talent pipeline, you have your semiconductor training institutes, you have these apprenticeships, the people stay there for a long time, and there's certain working culture that seems to work in a very sort of difficult and sort of, I think, a brutal industry. So continue to do those. And I think there's high-level buy-in from the government on the need to insulate TSMC. TSMC also understood there's a need now to move overseas. So it is set up in Germany, it's set up in Japan. And so I think continuing to support those moves, just continue to do what you're doing. I think you're already doing a great job.
Go ahead.
Maybe some quick points. First on Taiwan's industrial policy. It's funny that you ask the question because that's always the question I ask to Taiwanese friends. What are the good industrial policy ideas that you can share with the rest of the world. And usually the response I get is that there is no industrial policy in Taiwan, right? Even from Ministry of Economic Affairs, that's usually the response I get. Let's do not get into that, but we did a semiconductor industrial policy report at my institute that did some benchmark comparative analysis of the different tools used by different players for their semiconductor industries. And the idea that we picked up from Taiwan was really the links between the industry and the education system. That is something that is really to be learned from others. And on your question regarding the cost associated with economic security measures, to me, what I hear really relates to two measures that are currently being designed. The first one is this notion that trustworthiness as a cost, and it's now part of the G7 agenda. This was actually brought forward by the Japanese Ministry of Economy, and I think that this idea is gaining some ground. If you look at the recent G7 communiques, the idea that the additional cost of investment in the supply chain need to be addressed in a way or another. I think the policy idea is there. The specifics of the policy responses are not fully articulated yet. And the other elements from a policy perspective, and that's perhaps mostly European, is the public procurement elements. And when it comes to Europe, common purchasing at the European scale to have an impact on some of the strategic sectors is one of the policy responses that are being designed to address the problem you point out to.
We have about 5 minutes left. So before I close this section, I want to use the remaining time to ask you the question. We have talked a lot about the export control, but we talk relatively little on the industrial policy. I know that Japan, United States, and EU all rolled out a very, very big plan to attract the the IC manufacturing back to your home country. What do you think about the outlook of those industrial policy? Do you think it's going to be successful, or do you think it's just like what you said, that it's going to be just a waste of the money? And what do you think about those outlook? Akira, you want to start, or for us?
I think it depends. I look at what's going on in Kyushu area, TSMC, and business seems to be booming. I have a distant family member who lives there, and they're always complaining about, it used to be just a 7-minute bus ride from my home to the station. Now it's like half an hour. It's always full. The trains are always full, which means business is booming, right? More infrastructure is being built, surrounding businesses are all coming in, investments are pouring in. So I would say this is a success in terms of how much the Japanese government invested versus how much private capital they were able to bring in. And then there's the case of Rapidus in Hokkaido, which seems to be a little bit struggling in doing a similar thing in terms of bringing in the private capital. At the moment, roughly speaking, the Ministry of Economy has decided that they're going to commit at least 1 trillion yen, around 920 million yen to Rapidus project. But the investment from the private sector is limited. It's only about less than $100 million. I'm not sure why I'm using yen and dollars at the same. Anyways, it's like 1% or even less than 1% of what the government has invested so far. And there has been reports that the government is really pushing the private sector to invest more, and hopefully they're saying that maybe about 10% of what the government has committed will be committed from the private sector yet, but I have not really heard what has happened afterwards. Maybe there would be reports saying that, yes, there has been a commitment from the Japanese private sector that they're going to be putting more money in this. But I mean, I feel like this shows that there's a lack of investor confidence in the project in Rapidus. So once again, I think it really depends on the project itself. Sometimes it's a success, sometimes it's not. And maybe this is, once again, the cost of inefficiency, cost of trying to be dependent from certain countries.
I think it's a well thought out plan. I mean, it's comprehensive. So I think a lot of people sort of like simplistically say it's only about reshoring leading edge manufacturing. It is not true. They also are looking at legacy chips with global foundries. But even with this sort of leading edge stuff, I mean, there's ATP, advanced packaging technology facilities beside. They're also ensuring the HBM facilities with SK Hynix are setting up there. So all the things you need, I mean, all the bottlenecks, CoWoS on TSMC, your HBMs, your advanced circuits, your lead, mature stuff. They're also thinking very strongly about research partnerships, apprenticeships. So I think they're going about it in a thoughtful way. Whether they will be fully successful is difficult to say, but if the goal is a more limited one of domestic self-sufficiency, maybe going from the low single digits to 20% of global supply, then that is a realistic and achievable goal. Of course, there are challenges. I think talent is a big one. And I told a small group before, like when I was a teaching fellow at a certain engineering school for a module on the semiconductor industry, I remember there were a number of like year 6, year 7 physics PhDs, and I sort of asked them, I'm like, which of y'all are joining TSMC, Samsung, Intel? And they sort of looked at each other, they laughed, and they said, no, we're going to join Meta, Google, or do high-speed quant trading because the salaries are a lot higher. So attracting top talent whose best options are perhaps, doing like something like investment banking, earning $500,000 in a better working environment, not living in a desert, wearing a hazmat suit, that'll be difficult. But again, the US is aware of this. They're looking at apprenticeships programs. They're looking at stronger research collaborations, postdoc positions. So I don't think it's an insoluble problem, but I mean, it'll take time to see. But I think they're going about it in a thoughtful and sort of comprehensive way.
Yes, very shortly. I basically align with what Akira just said. I think it really depends on the project. And to mention only briefly the 2 large Taiwanese projects in Europe at the moment, I would be optimistic about TSMC in Dresden because the environment is there, the ecosystem is there, the supply chain is provided by the joint venture partners, the market is there, and the automotive industry is also there to stay. And I think I would be agnostic regarding the Prologium project in France. Prologium, can you remind me the name in Chinese so that everyone gets it? I'm not sure. The solid battery project that is taking place, excuse me? Thank you. Huineng. Because it's a new technology that has been prototyped already, but that needs to be produced in mass volume. That's really the challenge. And the question of what will be the future technological choice for the battery industry, solid or liquid, and what kind of liquid, etc., is very much in flux right now. When you speak with industry, there are different bets. So it really depends on many, many factors.
You want to add at the next?
Just a short comment about the regulation. I think the regulation of supply chains, supply chain sustainability and resilience, and there definitely is going to be some advantages, some improvements. But also, I think it will be enough if some simple rule, if someone causes harm within the supply chain, whole supply chain, if someone breaks the rule within the whole supply chain, he will be liable. I think it's a clear enough rule. But every that paperwork, reporting about sustainability, about cybersecurity, about deforestation, codes of conduct, corporate governance code, transition plan, etc. It's going to be a lot of paperwork, and I doubt someone will gonna read it after all.
Okay, it's a little bit over time, so let's conclude this section. Let's give a big hand to all the panelists here.